The following is a PragProg Hero's Journey with Paolo Perrotta, recorded in October 2020. Presented by the Pragmatic Bookshelf, home of timely, practical books on classic and cutting-edge topics. Find us online at pragprog.com and everywhere the finest tech books are sold.
Welcome, everybody, listening to this recording of the PragProg Hero's Journey. In this series, we sit down with some of the most interesting and influential authors in tech publishing to find out how they got where they are and to learn what advice they give to the next generation of up-and-coming tech authors. Today, we're talking with software developer, author, public speaker, agile coach, trainer, and world traveler, Paolo Perrotta. Paolo, welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today. It's great to have you here.
Hello, everybody. Very nice to be here.
So, Paolo, let's go back to the beginning of your journey as an author. And I think for you, that is Metaprogramming Ruby, published in 2010, which I once read you said it took you 3 years to write that book.
I did.
That's a big commitment. What inspired you to get started?
Back then, when I decided to write that book, I had already been writing articles for magazines, mostly paper magazines, about programming. In the very beginning, I think I was kind of blessed a little by not being really, really good at anything in particular. I was a decent coder, okay? But I wasn't like, a no-brainer hire. I was a freelancer, and I was a decent writer because I liked it, but I didn't do it for work. But if you have, a Venn diagram of these two, the overlap is really, really tiny. I mean, coders who can write, now you're in demand. And indeed, it happened that I think I read somebody posting on some forum on the internet, I took in 95, we have a magazine that we would like to know people who can write articles about coding, which, it was a small internet. So I ended up actually doing that. And I did it for a few years, and then it was like, oh wow, I think an article is 3 pages, and if I wrote so many articles, and writing 100 articles, it's a book worth of materials. So big mistake. I mean, it doesn't scale like that at all, but I didn't know. So I made the classic management mistake. Okay, you write 10 lines of code, so writing assistant should take, give me an envelope and I'll write it down. Right. And it didn't work like that, but I was blissfully unaware of it. So I decided I would love to write a book. I will count. I was reading a lot of Pragmatic Bookshelf books, so I contacted them, and that's how it happened.
Got it. So it sounds like you were writing articles, you decided, I'd like to try to write a book. Why this book? Why Metaprogramming Ruby? Was it something you were doing for work? Was it an idea that someone else gave to you? Why this idea?
In hindsight, it was pretty reckless because I was just fascinated by it. Like, I was reading blog posts from Olabini and stuff from, Wide Lucky Steve, these people who used to be personalities in the Ruby community. Yeah. And I was like, wow, this is mind-boggling. There must be a book around about this, and I couldn't find it. And then I moved straight to the conclusion that I could write that. I didn't consider all the in-betweens, like, do I actually know enough to write that book? So I literally learned the stuff as I wrote. Even worse, much of these techniques they didn't really have a name, a pattern-like description that people could agree on. It was more like, hey, you could use this thing in this way, and it was very big. So I had to come up with names for all those things. So it was overly ambitious. That's why it took so long. But in the end, I was lucky enough that it fill the niche because there wasn't anything like it. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I know that this is going back really over 10 years at this point, but I'm curious. So I get the connection. I get, how you got to this idea. You said that you were reading a lot of books from the Pragmatic Bookshelf. How did you know how to put together a proposal? How did you know how to go from, okay, I have an idea, I like this publisher, now here's the next step to getting in front of that publisher?
I didn't know how to put together a proposal, actually. Actually, what happened was that even in that case, I started in a relatively sensible way. Back then, the Prags had a line of very short books for screen reading, like 50 pages. And I proposed one of those. So it was, it was low effort, relatively low commitment, and they accepted it. And it probably wasn't the most compelling proposal ever, but it's probably something that can, cut mustard. And then, as I started writing, it quickly became obvious that 50 pages wouldn't be enough, or 100, and that's how it ballooned into a full book. And by then, it was, I wouldn't say too big to fail, but there was already a partial commitment from everybody involved. So at that point, it was kind of a no-brainer to go forward and make it bigger. I hoped. I don't know how much of it was because I had a good proposal. I would say no.
No, but that is a really interesting point, and it's something that I definitely try to talk with new authors about, that sometimes you go into a book with an expectation. You think like, this is the book I'm writing, and either you're talking page length or you think like, this is the table of contents. Absolutely. And you get into it and it changes, dramatically. And we like to think for the better, because you're working, the author's learning more about the topic, you're working with an editor, you're getting technical review and stuff, but it's not set in stone. At the beginning, like you said, the beginning of the proposal is you, the author, us, the publisher, we're all kind of in agreement that, yeah, this basically sounds like a good idea, but things can change, and in your case, it grew. Sometimes they get much shorter. Sometimes it's the person with the 400-page book that turns into a 200-page book, which is fine.
I would like to know that person. but I trust your broader experience. It does happen.
That one doesn't happen as often. That's true. It's usually the other way. It's usually the 200-page book that becomes the 300-page book. But
especially because speaking of things changing, when you start writing a book, usually you send in maybe a test chapter or. And when I got my feedback about my test chapter from the Prags, they totally ripped into it. They've always been very polite in giving feedback, and they put a positive spin on it. But it was clear that what they meant was, this sucks. And it did. It was, I remember they said, it's choppy. You can't see a storyline here. Stuff is jumping in and out without rhyme or reason. I don't know what I'm reading. I don't have signposts. And that was, I had to change this, and I had to structure it into a storyline. So that creates a lot of, that introduces a lot of change to the plan. Yeah. So I had to change.
And that happened at the proposal stage, you said? That happened with the sample chapter.
No, it happened with it wasn't, the sample chapter was not in the proposal. I'd been working on it for like 2 months.
Okay.
And that meant that I had to go back to the drawing board and rethink the entire book. I can't exactly remember whether that was the time that it ballooned into a full book, but it might have been. In any case, it was an endangered project, a challenged project at first. I wasn't sure that it was happening until well into writing,
Yeah.
like until 4 or 5 chapters in.
Yeah. I think that happens a lot.
Yeah.
So you submit the proposal. Ultimately, you get to yes. We're going to do this book. You get the contract. How did you feel? Were you excited? Were you scared? Or did you, because it was your first book, maybe you weren't scared. Maybe you were like, all right, no problem. I can do this.
Yeah. My expectations were so low. I would say that I was much more, nervous about my latest book, because now I have, something to stand up to. But with my first book, I was like, oh, it's gonna sell 30 copies. I mean, I don't care. It's fine. I mean, so many people I met in my life, they paid money of their own pocket to see their name on a real physical book.
Yeah.
And I'm getting people to do that for me. And, that's a matter of personal gratification. So I don't care that it will probably flop, essentially.
Yeah.
I remember back then when the book came out, it didn't come out in beta. It came out in, I don't think there was a beta program back then. So it's the book. It's release day. Okay, it's Big Bang release day, and there was this real-time dashboard where I could see the numbers going up, and I kept refreshing the page. Like, I was absolutely shocked. Like, people are buying this. It was that was the emotional moment, because it was okay. I got the contract. Then I delivered the book, and it was more like a relief. Oh wow, I made it. Okay, done. And then I start seeing people buying the book, and I'm like, this cannot possibly be. I sold 30 copies actually before I even checked the site, and now it's more copies every time I refresh. And that was the moment. But in the very beginning, I had very, very low expectations.
It's funny. You're not the first author to tell me that that on their first book, the shocking moment wasn't necessarily getting signed. It wasn't even writing it. It was when the sales start happening, and it's like that's the first time it hit them that, oh wow, this is out in the world. People are reading this. I had one author tell me, they, a couple of days after their book went into print, they get this email from someone saying, oh, we're building this application for our company and we're using your book and we have a question about, he said, and it was the first time that it dawned on me that, oh yeah, people are going to use this to do like real world work. And he said that was, if he had been thinking about that more, the weight of that as he was writing the book, he said, I might have been too scared to continue at some point. Because he said, I was in my mind, I'm just thinking, oh, this is, people just want to learn this stuff and I'm learning it and I'm explaining it. He said, and then you realize, people are going to build real stuff because of what I have in this book. So
I can actually walk into a company and see my book on a desk, and it did happen. And when you realize it can happen, it's not just, oh yeah, I wrote this book. If you search very carefully on Amazon, it's on the second page. And actually now you're walking into an office and people are reading your darn book, and it's wow, live. That's the mind-boggling part. Yeah, that's the step up.
So, okay, so if you had very low expectations and you didn't necessarily have some of that going into this first book, would you say there were surprises in terms of the writing itself? You had written a lot of articles. Now you said that it turned out not to scale like you had thought, originally. What would you say the surprises about writing a book itself, the actual process of writing? What was a surprise on that first book for you?
Okay, making a direct comparison to software development, because I've been doing a lot of that and doing agile coaching. So always talking to people about how hard it is to estimate software projects. And after writing that book, I started telling people, look, you think that's hard, you should try writing a book. The planning is absolutely, it's almost comical how wrong you get when, at least me, I don't know, maybe other people might not, but if I think back, at one point I was like, okay, this is done. I'm essentially done. Okay, I work on these 5 more days, 7 days tops, and I can call it a day. Finally, it's been a long time, the book is done.
Yeah.
And in hindsight, I had like 25% of my work in front of me. And it's if you think about it like that, it's ridiculous. I mean, when you are maybe 3/4 of the way through, you know that you have some unspecified vast amount of work in front of you, like this black thing, at least. But no, I was convinced that, hey, it's another pass through and I fix a few things and it's done. So that's how difficult it was for me personally, at least, to estimate the amount of work that I would pour into this book. And actually, as I kept writing, even in my latest book, I didn't get better at it. I just started, applying maybe a more agile way of thinking, where I estimate in tokens, and then I find out how big a token really is. But actually, every single chapter is like this mini project that is never completely closed until the book is closed. But in itself, it goes through all the peaks and valleys of, making a project. You know that diagram that floats around the internet with the valley of despair, the peak of inflated expectations. That's exactly what happened every time. So much so that at some point I just stopped fighting it. I mean, my wife, for example, she was like, okay, I was like, this chapter I'm writing is unreadable. It's really crappy. It sucks. I will never be able to fix this. The entire project is doomed. And she was like, sure. Oh, it's that day of the week. And after a couple of days, I was like, wow, this is the best thing I ever wrote. Yeah. And she was like, here it comes. And this happened for each single chapter, essentially. And I know it sounds so ridiculous, but that's, at one point I got used to that, but I never learned to estimate. And that was, to me, the hardest part of writing a book.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And that is, I think that's a challenge for everybody, no matter how many books you write. I think that's always, my favorite thing is when I'm talking with people who are proposing their first book to us. They've never written a book, and especially if they haven't even written a lot of articles, and they'll send in the contract, we ask them, give us an estimated timeline. And they, they'll have a 250-page book, and they're like, I think I can get this done in about 3 weeks. Maybe an extra week if you're going to copy edit or something. And then, you try not to laugh because you've been on the other side of it, right? And you understand. You're like, well, let's take a step back. And, they never want to believe it. If you're like, let's talk more in terms of months. Let's maybe even think like this could be a year-long project. A year? No, never, because
it must be fun for you.
Well, and so you mentioned, so you have your latest book and everything. So you did metaprogramming, you do metaprogramming too. You have programming, machine learning. Some parts of it must have gotten easier, even if the estimation hasn't gotten easier. Is there anything that has gotten easier as you've gone from book to book to book?
Well, now I'm confident that the book will be done. Oh. And another thing is that now I wasn't so optimistic the second time around writing a book from scratch, that I decided to juggle writing a book and a regular consulting freelancing career. The second time around, I was like, okay, I'm going into writing a book and essentially not going to freelance or minimal freelancing until the book is delivered, because it's simply too much pain and too hard to juggle these two things. Yeah. I also, it's 10 years take their toll, and 10 years ago or 12 years ago, I was able to, go freelancing for the entire day, write a little bit during lunch break, and then go back home and write and moonlight on the book. this is, I'm just not able to do that today. And so I had to make a choice. So that kind of experience, yes. It's the same kind of experience you get with software projects. You don't really get faster, you get more effective, and you allocate your time in a smarter way. That was for me, at least. That maybe some people are good at estimating, but I think that there are a lot of recommendations you get from experienced authors that never really worked for me. Stuff like set aside time, set aside a few hours every day, write a few pages every day. It never really worked for me because I'm totally convinced that this is work. It's not some kind of divine inspiration or anything. But on those days where you can't write, you just can't write. It's just hard. So I always found it hard to keep a cadence, which also probably impacts my ability to estimate.
But I think it's really important for people to hear that, because that is, you're right, that so often the message is, all I do is I set aside so many minutes a day at a set time. And that's great. That works for some people, but like you said, there's a whole other approach to it. And obviously your approach works, well too. And I think that's something that authors figure out. And the more they write, they figure out what does work for them. And the most important part is what you said is, no matter how you break it up, it's a huge commitment. So somehow you're putting in the work, somehow you're putting in the time, but there are a lot of ways to find that time and figure out when to put the work in. So
yeah. I mean, you certainly need to be disciplined because it's a long-term effort. And if you are not very disciplined, you will never ever get so. But discipline can take multiple forms in the day, in the here and now. And it's not necessarily, okay, I will work every day from 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. That never worked for me personally.
Yeah. So it's really, maybe this is too poetic, but it's almost like authors writing the book are also kind of learning about themselves because it's something that's new. And so they're kind of learning, how they do their best work. And I think that's part of how you get better at it, is you learn more with each book about how you do your best writing, and you found you couldn't fit yourself into these boxes in that way.
Yeah, I mean, usually you don't do, I mean, it can happen in other fields, but it's not every day that you get a multi-year project that's almost entirely on your shoulders. You're not alone when you write a book, but if you can't keep up, then you fail, that's for sure. So your work doesn't guarantee success, but your lack of work does guarantee failure. And you've got to do that for years on end. And you don't get as much feedback as you need. You have an editor, but you don't get people telling you, look, this book is, I didn't understand what you were saying. That kind of feedback, you don't get it until the very last stages. So you kind of work not really in the dark, but there is, it's like old-fashioned software projects. So, when you got the final testing phases after years, and those failed for a reason, and you are nervous about what's coming at the end. So, yeah.
So one question I have for you, because this isn't true for every author, but it is true for you, and I think it's an interesting thing to hear about, is, I mean, obviously you speak English, excellently. You sound like, and your writing too. I mean, you wouldn't know. You read your writing and you think, oh, this is a native English speaker, but obviously you're not a native English speaker. So what do you think the extra either challenges or benefits are of, writing these types of books, something very complex, but ultimately in a foreign language? Because it comes up, a lot of times we get authors who are not native English speakers, and that becomes the final thing that makes them decide, well, I had a really good idea. I think I know the topic, but I'm afraid it's not my native language, and we always try to encourage them, no, you can still. What would you say to those authors?
It's I think that people, when it comes to foreign languages, you also speak foreign languages, right? You speak German, and you know that there are multiple ways to get it wrong, and it depends on your personal attitude towards the language. So I still make a lot of English mistakes, but I have a good editor. So I'm not worried. None of those will pass by my editor. She will immediately spot them and say, okay, this doesn't sound like proper English, this reads weird, and so on. It might be more of a problem if your vocabulary is really small, because then your book starts reading like fourth grade. But I have a good vocabulary. My weaknesses lie elsewhere. So, so I know that I have these, this editor angel over my shoulder, fixing those, taking care that this sentence is not going anywhere, or really you swapped these two words. Maybe you meant this other thing, and I don't. Well, it's hard to say, it's very personal, but for me, it was never a big problem about expressing myself in English. I had just a tolerable level of English I couldn't write a novel, but I can get away with a technical book, just because the range of expression is narrower, I guess.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Right. It's, yeah, two different styles of writing. One is maybe a little bit, lends itself better to a foreign language speaker. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, so I was going to ask you, because this kind of goes along with that, just the idea of expectations when someone starts to write a book, because when I talk with first-time authors, beyond their fears, right? A lot of it, that's a lot of what you hear is, the reasons they're afraid to write the book. When you move beyond that, you start saying, well, what are other reasons you want to write a book? Some of them will tell you, oh, I think my book will change the whole, technology industry, or I think I'm going to have a bestseller. Like, they imagine their idea is so unique, like, I'm going to make $1 million off of this book. And for anybody listening, I'll tell you, there are very few tech books that are going to make $1 million. But some do very well. Other people just are looking for a way to build their resume. But when you talk with them at the end of the book, now it is 9, 10, 12 months later, and you say, what did you get out of writing this book? This is not what I thought. They would totally, this was what was really good about doing it. What would you say is the benefit for you personally of writing a book? Why do it? Because it's a lot of work, like you said.
Well, maybe it will earn you $1 million. Maybe not on sales. Maybe in a very indirect, torturous way, where you turn back after 20 years. I didn't earn my $1 million, but I earned a good living, and I turned back after all these many years, and I was like, okay, this was a necessary step, because if I hadn't written this book, I wouldn't have moved on to, speak so much at conferences. I wouldn't have met this person who put me in touch with my next job, and so on and so forth. It's a career element. I wouldn't call it a step, but for sure, in some environments, having written a book, it can win you authority. Like, for example, if you are planning to speak a lot at conferences. I wrote a book on Ruby, and I would say that I don't think I ever got a submission to a Ruby conference turned down, because now I had written a popular Ruby book, and it's not the only thing. Maybe I'd wager most of the people who came to those conferences didn't know about me. Maybe they'd heard about the book, but still, it's a thing. It's part of that thing, and of course, it gives you a sense of closure, because now things are changing. Maybe in a few years, paper books in particular won't be a thing in the technical field, at least. But growing up amongst the books, I read I'm ranting a bit here, sorry, Dave, but I read this tweet once from DHH, David Heinemeier Hansen, saying, oh, you know, older people, they care so much about having a big bookshelf, these walls of books, that's so old, it's, you know, polluting. I don't know which terms he used. Yeah. And I was like, okay, yeah, I know, you're right. It's dead trees, but it's an innocent fetish, you know, and we are very happy with this thing. We grew up amongst books, so there is still something mystical in the sense of mystique about holding a book with your name on it in your hand. And you know, it's not I wouldn't say, okay, work for 3 years so you can experience that moment, because that moment is really fleeting, and after 10 minutes you are back to, you know, worrying about you know, cooking your meal or whatever. But it's part of what you are afterwards. I did a lot of things in my career, including writing that book. It's on Amazon. You know, I know that's not a motivation, but let's say that in hindsight, I'm glad I wrote it, mostly because of that. Yeah. And of course, I couldn't have any guarantee that it would help my career, but in hindsight, it did. So yeah, it was essentially, if you want to do it, then yeah, why not? We are engineers. We do so many things just because, and then they turn out to earn us money. Programmers, right? So,
yeah. You know, what's funny is that you are not the first person to use the word mystical when they talk about it. Yeah. And so I really think that's a thing. I think, you know, that's what they say, you know, the process of having this idea, and then when you hold the book in your hand at the end, there it is, this idea that you had now fully formed, your name, the cover, the everything. And they've said that before. It's a mystical experience to see, you know, this thing in print. So,
I remember what Ted Brooks, I think, wrote it. That one of the joys of being a developer is that at some point you create this machine made of thought, and then you step back and you watch it. You watch it run. You know, you watch all the little clockwork pieces working. And this idea of stepping back and, wow, I made this. It's you know, it's a nice thing, and I built it. It's kind of like the same when you're talking about a book, and it's a physical artifact.
Yeah.
So that adds a lot to this nice, oh wow, step back moment. This is mine. Then you put it on a shelf. You forget about it maybe, but that, you know, it's you do it in somehow in anticipation of that moment.
Yeah. And like you said, then you go into an office and you see your book there, and you're like, oh, look, there's my book now in someone else's office, and all of that. But
I remember one, I won't name the author because that wasn't a public declaration he made, but he told me he was a very popular author, and one of his collaborators told me that he had this habit whenever he passed by any city. He was traveling a lot. Back then it was almost exclusively paper books, and he entered the local libraries and you know, bookshops, and he looked for his book, and he turned the book around so that essentially you saw any passersby would see this book turned around, and out of curiosity say, okay, what is this? Read the cover. And so yeah, so it was a very, you know, very cunning marketing, but it also speaks volumes to this idea that this is a physical thing that you find around, and it's yours. You walk into this building and they have your book. It's nice. It doesn't happen anymore, but it was nice.
No, it doesn't. And that's a pretty funny marketing strategy. It's I like it. I've never heard that one.
But smart, yeah.
Right. Okay, well, lastly, you know, you started your book authoring career with us. You've stuck with us as your publisher for all these years, and we're extremely grateful for that. At this point, you could easily go to any other publisher you want. They would sign you, you know, right away. So my question is, why do you keep choosing to publish books with us?
It's kind of a no-brainer, honestly. Now it sounds like I'm not being polite or, speaking by professional obligation, but publishing with the prags whenever I can, that until the situation changes radically, that's a no-brainer. In the very beginning, it was. They were by far the most respected publishers in that particular niche. It was a Ruby book, so that in the Ruby community, the prags were the publisher. They gave you like 5 times more royalties than other publishers, which doesn't, I mean, it's not because of the money, it's because of the feeling of fairness of it. You know, you don't feel like somebody's making money off your back. You feel like being in a partnership. So that even if I thought, okay, this book won't make money, but if it makes $100, a sizable chunk of that is my money, which makes me feel good about this relationship. And the prags were way ahead, as far as I know, amongst publishers in having a system that actually was leveraging technology to build a book. Because back then it was almost funny, because there were so many big publishers who asked you as an author, as far as I know, by talking with other authors, they asked you things like, okay, you write your book in Microsoft Word, and you've got to take care of all the formatting and all the code in it, and then we take this thing and we essentially publish it, and which gives you a lot of negative feelings about, first, what's your job exactly? Second, do I have to learn how to do formatting, which is totally not something I can do. I'm already learning how to write, possibly. Yeah. It's my first book. And also what happens when all of the little mistakes in my code, which I'm supposed to keep aligned with my runnable code examples, what happens when people find those and it's my fault. And the entire process is so awkward. While the prags were like, okay, you're a geek. You know what a build machine is. You know how to write with, back then it was an XML dialect. And you can do this and you see the result. And everything is automated as far as we can automate it. And once again, it's both that, okay, this is the way to work, and the fact that you get a feeling that, wow, I'm doing my part and you're already doing yours. I mean, we are both into this, and we're both working hard, because building this system and keeping it running is serious work. So that was. Those were multiple reasons, apart from, my personal pleasure of saying, okay, I'm working with Andy Hunt and Dave Thomas. Those were all valid reasons. And I think that some of those reasons maybe are not quite as compelling these days, like some other publishers kind of catched up on the technology, but only kind of. I still think that the process that the prags give me, and the feeling of being, involved, because it's ultimately a small bunch of people, and you never get these. I publish with other publishers, not stuff that not books, but I publish online courses and so on. And the important thing with publishers is that they feel cozy. You are talking to somebody and you know that this person cares, and you have a saying, and you don't get, milled by the machine. Yeah. And I was always lucky, I got to say, in all of my, different publishing contracts. But when it comes to books, I wouldn't hedge my bet. I don't think I will write more books, but if I always say that, and if I ever do, It will be with the tracks.
Well, thank you, and I hope that you write more books. Please write more books. Just you're so good at it, and at this point, you have all this experience, and we know the readers love what you do. But we will be here to help you publish anything we can. We love working with you, and we look forward to doing more in any way. But well, thank you so much, Paolo. It's been wonderful talking with you today, and I know that people will definitely find it inspiring. So. Thank you again for that, and thank you for everything you've done with us.
Thank you.
This has been a PragProg Hero's Journey, brought to you by the Pragmatic Bookshelf. For the best in tech book publishing, visit us online at pragprog.com.